May 13, 1969, Kuala Lumpur. The city was tense. The general election had just ended, and for the first time since independence, the ruling Alliance Party had lost its two-thirds majority. In working-class neighborhoods, especially among the Chinese population, the mood was hopeful. Opposition parties like DAP and Gerakan had made big gains. For many, it felt like change was finally coming, but in other parts of the country, the reaction was very different. What some saw as a democratic shift, others saw as a threat. Victory parades broke out in parts of the cities, with supporters waving flags and chanting slogans. A few carried brooms, symbolizing a clean sweep. That gesture meant to be symbolic was taken some as deeply provocative. On May 13, a large pro-government procession was organized in response, but it never ended. By evening, they turned into full-blown riots. Shops burned, people were attacked on the streets. The police lost control of the situation and the military had to step in. Curfews were imposed, bodies were buried in silence, and a new political order was about to be built, one that would define Malaysia as of today. This is the story of May 13, a story about race, resentment, fear, and how a young nation nearly tore itself apart just 12 years after independence. In 1969, Malaysia was only 12 years old, but the division in its society were far older. To understand what happened on May 13, you have to look back decades earlier to the foundation of the nation itself. Before independence, Malaysia was under British colonial rule, which at that time was called Malaya. Malaya was never built to be a unified nation, it was built to serve an empire. The British practiced a policy known as divide and rule. Malays were encouraged to stay in rural areas and focus on agriculture. Chinese immigrants were brought in to work the tin mines and run businesses in towns. Indians were often employed on rubber plantations. Each community had its own role, its own schools, its own newspaper, and its own economy. The result was a country where people shared a space, but not a sense of nationhood. By independence in 1957, the consequences of this system were clear. The Malay population, mostly rural, had political power, but many lived in poverty. The Chinese population, especially in cities, dominated commerce and industry, but lacked political influence. The Indian community, smaller in number, often lived on the margins. When Malaysia achieved independence, the leadership created a coalition government called the Alliance Party, a partnership between three major ethnic-based parties: UMNO, representing the Malays; MCA, Malaysian Chinese Association; and MIC, the Malaysian Indian Congress. This was a marriage of convenience, not conviction. Power was distributed delicately. The Malays were given special privileges, including quotas in education, land ownership, and government jobs meant to correct historical disadvantages. But not everyone was happy with this compromise. Some Malays felt the special rights didn't go far enough. Others in the Chinese and Indian communities felt they went too far. As economic disparity continued, especially with urban Chinese growing wealthier, resentment grew on all sides. And by the 1960s, political pressures was mounting. In the years before 1969, new political parties emerged, ones that challenged the alliance ethnic formula. Gerakan, a multiracial party with Chinese majority leadership, gained popularity for calling for equal treatment for all races. And on the other hand, Malay political sentiment also began to shift. PAS, the Pan-Malaysia Islamic Party, was gaining ground in rural areas by promoting Islamic governance. This new policy landscape set the stage for a showdown. On 10 May 1969, Malaysians went to the polls. The results were shocking. The Alliance Party vote share dropped from 58% in 1964 to 44%. It lost control of Selangor, Perak, and Penang. Gerakan and DAP made major gains, winning 13 seats, a major leap forward. For the Chinese opposition, it was a celebration. For many Malay nationalists, it felt like a defeat, and the tone of the celebration made things worse. On 11 and 12 May, victorious opposition parties organized procession through Kuala Lumpur. Thousands took to the streets waving party flags, chanting slogans and celebrating the alliance loss. But some reports suggest that the parade crossed a line. There were chants mocking the government. Some accounts claim that taunts were directed at Malay bystanders. Others mention that some marches carried communist symbols, heightening fears among conservatives and the Malay elites. Even if many of these accounts were exaggerated or unverifiable, the perception was already planted that the Chinese community was gloating and that the Malay dignity had been insulted. The Malay community in Kampong Baru, a stronghold of UMNO youth, began organizing a response. On 13 May, a large Malay rally was planned. Officially, it was meant to be a peaceful counter-demonstration organized by UMNO in support of the government and in protest of the opposition's behavior. But beneath the surface, something far more volatile was on the rise. Thousands of Malay youth, some reportedly armed, began gathering in Kampong Baru. They were joined by members of youth wings from UMNO and other groups. And as the sun dipped behind the skyline of Kuala Lumpur, tensions reached a breaking point. The city was turning into a powder keg. It just needed a spark. Thousands of Malay youth had gathered for what was called as a political procession in support of the ruling Alliance Party, stung by their recent election losses. But this wasn't just a rally. The air was heavy with anger, rumors, and revenge. The plan was to march through Kuala Lumpur to send a message. But the parade never began. Instead, around 6:30 p.m., clashes broke out in the Setapak area. The details are murky, and some accounts say it started when a group of Malays attacked Chinese residents. Others say it was sparked by a confrontation between opposing youths. Within minutes, violence exploded across the city. Mob formed, shops were looted, people were dragged from vehicles and beaten, homes and businesses were set on fire. Targets were not chosen randomly, but racially. Chinese neighborhoods bore the burn. Chinese-owned shops were torched. Chinese civilians were attacked, many killed on the spot. The police, caught off guard and outnumbered, were unable to contain the violence. By 7 p.m., Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia's capital, was out of control. At around 7:30 p.m., the government declared a state of emergency. Troops from the army were deployed onto the streets. Curfews were imposed, and anyone caught outside without permission could be shot. The army's presence brought a fragile kind of order, but not before unimaginable damage had already been done. By midnight, fires still burned. Sirens echoed across the streets. Entire districts looked like a war zone, and in many homes, families of all races huddled in fear, not knowing if the violence was over or just beginning. Officially, the number of people killed in the May 13 riots is listed as 196. Diplomatic cables, journalists, and even some of the members of the government suggested the real figure was far higher, possibly even over 1,000. Most of the victims were Chinese civilians. Others were Malay caught in the wrong place. There were even reports of Indian families being attacked, caught in the conflict that wasn't theirs. As violence escalated, so did the government control over information. On May 14, the federal government suspended parliament and declared emergency rule. A new body, the National Operations Council, was formed, led by Tun Abdul Razak, the deputy prime minister at the time. Censorship was immediate. Newspapers were ordered not to report freely on the violence. Foreign journalists were restricted. Radio broadcasts were carefully managed. The goal was to prevent panic and to control the narrative. But the lack of transparency only deepened distrust. Rumors spread like wildfire, but in a vacuum of truth, anything can become a possible headline. As the army worked to restore order on the streets, Malaysia's political elites gathered behind closed doors. Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman, once hailed as the father of independence, was visibly shaken. His authority weakened. Power began shifting to his deputy, Tun Abdul Razak, a man known for being pragmatic and less idealistic. Under Razak and the NOC, Malaysia would begin a period of authoritarian control, justified as necessary for peace, but with far-reaching consequences. Because in the vacuum left by May 13, the government didn't just want to restore peace, they wanted to reshape the country. In the immediate aftermath of the May 13 riots, Malaysia didn't just enter a state of emergency, it entered a new era. The old rules no longer applied. The temporary authoritarian body, the NOC, was in charge. But temporary would prove to be a flexible term. At the helm of this new power structure was Tun Abdul Razak, the deputy prime minister, and increasingly the man in charge. Internally, the calls for change grew louder. By 1970, under immense pressure, Tunku Abdul Rahman stepped down. He was replaced by Tun Abdul Razak, who would take Malaysia in a very different direction. One focused on ethnic restructuring, state control, and long-term social engineering. Its mission wasn't just to restore order, it was to reassert Malay dominance over the political, economical, and social fabric of Malaysia. Every move from this point forward, from economic policies to education reforms, language laws to media censorship, would be designed with one goal: to prevent another May 13. But what that really means was this: never again should the Malays feel threatened. In 1971, a year after Razak officially became prime minister, the government launched what would become the most transformative national plan in Malaysian history, the new economical policy. On paper, the NEP had two goals: eradicate poverty regardless of race, restructure society to eliminate the identification of race with economic function. But in practice, the NEP was focused on affirmative action for Malays and other Bumiputras, or natives of the land. Because in 1970, despite Malays making up over 50% of the population, they own only about 2.4% of the country's corporate wealth. By contrast, the Chinese minority, though just over 30% of the population, controlled much of the urban economy, especially in business, trade, and industry. To many Malays, this wasn't just an economic issue, it was an existential one. The NEP set out to correct this by redistributing wealth, increasing Malay ownership, and limiting the dominance of other ethnic groups in certain sectors. It was meant to last 20 years, but its legacy would last much longer. So what did the NEP do? Gave quotas for Malays in university admissions, civil service jobs, and government contracts, introducing shareholding targets to ensure 30% of corporate equity went to Bumiputras, encouraged Malay participation in professional sectors like law, finance, and engineering. Supporters saw it as a necessary correction, an attempt to build a more equal society after decades of imbalance. Critics saw it as a discrimination, which replaced one form of inequality with another. It wasn't just policy that changed. Malaysia's national identity was rewritten. The ruling party, UMNO, began to redefine itself as the protector of Malays' rights. The educational system shifted. Malay became the dominant medium of instruction, and English language schools were phased out. Censorship tightened. Discussions around May 13 were taboo, not only in the media but in classrooms and even private conversation. Universities were banned from participating in political activities under the University and College Act. May 13 was not to be discussed. It was to be remembered silently. One of the most strategic moves after the riot was political. Instead of silencing the opposition through force, Tun Razak co-opted them. The ruling Alliance Party was expanded into a new coalition, the Barisan Nasional. It brought in several former opposition parties, including Gerakan and the Islamic Party. In return, these parties were given a role in governance, but only within the boundaries set by UMNO. BN would go to dominate Malaysian politics for the next 4 decades, winning nearly every election by wide margins, all while controlling the media and using May 13 as a silent warning to all those who step out of line. For many Malays, especially in rural areas, the BN offered new opportunities in education, employment, and business. It created a new Malay middle class and, in some cases, wealthy elite. But for many Chinese and Indian Malaysians, the message was clear. You're still citizen, but no longer equal. Though most Malaysians weren't born when it happened, everyone still lived in its shadow. Malay feared being dominated in their own land. Chinese feared being scapegoated again. Indians felt increasingly invisible. The result? Self-censorship, segregated schools, racial quotas, and distrust became normal. In elections, political parties were split by race. In cities, people lived in racial enclaves, and in conversation, certain topics like May 13 remained off limits. Even peaceful protests were seen as dangerous. But in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, things started to shift. A younger generation of Malaysians began pushing back against corruption, inequality, and race-based policies. The Reformasi movement, led by figures like Anwar Ibrahim, began to break the old political mold. For the first time, they were called for a multiracial Malaysia, where identity was less about race and more about shared values. Then come 2018. For the first time in history, Malaysia's ruling party, Barisan Nasional, which had ruled since May 13, lost power. A coalition of Malay, Chinese, Indians came together to vote for a change. The victory of Pakatan Harapan sent a powerful message. Malaysia was ready to move forward together. Perhaps something will change in the future. Today, a new generation is emerging, one that wasn't raised on May 13. They grew up on TikTok and YouTube, not textbook filled with state propaganda. They live in a digital Malaysia, not a censored one. They cared less about race and more about fairness, climate, jobs, and representation. They want a Malaysia that reflects who they are. You can't fix what you don't face. And for too long, Malaysia tried to run from its darkest days. But healing doesn't come from silence, it comes from truth. That means revisiting May 13 honestly, not to blame, not to divide, but to learn. And most of all, it means daring to believe that Malaysia's best days are not behind it, but ahead. And thanks again for watching to the end. To all Malaysians out there, happy Independence Month. And as always, have a great one and peace out.